Well, let's look at today's reading, and we're looking at, I heard today someone describe this reading as the communist reading, although it's very similar to the one that we had on Sunday. Let me tell you what the reading is first, and then we're going to go from there. The reading is Acts 4:32 through 37, and it is talking about the community and how they all live together. And so let's look at that from Acts 4 and see what it is that they say. So, I'm going to read it to you so that we can have an understanding. And always remember that I read this material from the Catholic Public Domain version. Okay. Then the multitude of believers were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things that he possessed were his own, but all things were common to them. And neither was anyone among them in need, for as many as were owners of fields or houses selling these were bringing the proceeds of the things that they were selling, and were placing it before the feet of the apostles. Then it was divided to each one just as he had need. That's literally a principle in communism. We'll get back to that. Now Joseph, who the apostles surnamed Barnabas, which is translated as son of consolation, who was a Levite of Cyprian descent, since he had land, had sold it, and he brought the proceeds and placed these at the feet of the apostles. So there you have this powerful reading. Now, I just want to look at something because there is a fascinating aspect of this in the very next, the very next chapter, but it isn't one of the readings we're reading because it skips around. So I'll get back to that. So here they are. They're a community of believers, and what they're doing is they're sharing their resources. This is literally how a religious community works if they take the vow of poverty. The vow of poverty does not mean that they live to be poor. The vow of poverty means that they own nothing. Now, this literally does sound like communism, and this is literally the concept that Marx was thinking of, not necessarily this passage because he was an atheist, but this idea when he came up with communism. I just finished Richard Wolff's book on Marxism, which was great, a very basic explanation, or very good explanation. Basic wasn't the right word. And Richard Wolff, if you do not know, is a professor. He used to teach in Massachusetts, I believe at UMass Amherst. I could be wrong there. He's now a professor emeritus of economy, and he is of economics, and he is a socialist. I don't think he is a Marxist, but he is a socialist. I don't think he's a communist either. And he explains that communism, as we've seen it on the earth, is not what Marx had thought of. Now, the most perfect system of communism exists in the fictional world of Star Trek. So obviously it's perfect because it's fiction. But Star Trek actually lives by the communist system, and it's very similar to this. So what you have is something that is very Jewish, by the way, because a kibbutz, which is a Jewish concept, comes from the same idea. And what it is that you have people who do work. They're working all day. They may be working the fields. They may own the fields and then go out and work them. They do all this all day, but the entire community shares the resources. So they will share the income. They will share the products. They will share everything. And in doing so, now this system is benefiting everybody. And so what happens is when you have people who are part of this system, the concept that they have to go out looking for a job, they have to be hired, they have to have none of that exists because they all belong to this community. Now there have been places that are built like this. I am a baby boomer. And this was a concept that existed very strongly during the hippie days. And it's the commune. And some of them still exist. And the Catholic worker movement put together a system like that. I think it was called Walden Farm, if I'm not wrong. And it was the system that everyone owned everything in common. and work the system, work the land and everything else. So that's why this is called the communist system, the communist passage. But why does it work? They have a united passion in saving souls, saving each other's souls, and being a community of people who are centered on the Lord. That's what it needs to work. You need that center, that they're all centered on the Lord, that they all have a common mission, that their mission. So then you may have the situation, I'm just doing this off the top of my head in a sense, and then knowing from history, you may have the situation where the community gathers on a regular basis and says, so-and-so is really upset about something that happened to her family or his family, who are not part of our community. We need to pray for so-and-so. This person over here seems to have some kind of pain that we don't know what it is, and we want to be there for them. That's the community coming together. So not only do they share resources, they share passion and they share each other's mutual support. And now some communes, not Christian communes, go even further, and those are the ones that will share sexual companions. That's when you're getting into the really bizarre stuff, and you want to keep away from those groups. But those communes, some of them do still exist, but some of them are based on this. And they're based on the idea is that they come together as a community. But what makes them different than just like hippie communes is in service to the Lord. And they're going to engage in prayer meetings. They're going to engage in different types of seeking miracles, seeking healings, prophecy, all that. They're going to come together and they're going together worship the Lord as a people within the kingdom. So that's one of the things that you want to realize as you look at that this is what is being addressed here, this very powerful moment. And religious communities live by that today. Your Benedictines live like that. Your Trappists, so Benedictines, Trappists, some of the other communities live like that. So you have Benedictines, you have Trappists, you have, Capuchins live like that. I do believe that's what Cardinal O'Malley is. You have some very, there's a whole bunch. Jesuits live like that. Franciscans live like that. So they all work together. Like, for example, here's a good example. Or a Jesuit. Now, Jesuit have several degrees. So you have these people who live in the house, and they're all Jesuits, and they also have lots of degrees. So they may work a certain place as a priest and something else. So you may have a priest psychiatrist, and as a psychiatrist, they may pull in 6 figures of salary. But that 6 figures of salary goes to the order. So if you were going to hire him for your hospital, we'll say, and you were to, you say, well, now he works in the hospital and he fulfills a position that is 6 figures in salary. We'll say well into the 6 figures. We'll say he has a $300,000 job. Okay. So obviously every 2 weeks or every month or every week, you have to send a paycheck to that person. Well, what do? You actually don't. You sent it to the Society of Jesus, and that's in their particular order where they're based, and that's the society that gets the salary, and that money is shared with the whole community. Well, now, if you really think about it, this is one of the things. There's an old joke about the difference between diocesan and religious, and there's a certain truth to it, but you have to understand why. Some of the religious vow poverty, but we live it. Well, that's the reason why. But that's really kind of a joke. meaning literally a joke. I'm not mocking it because, yeah, we don't have that system. So I live by my one salary. Whereas if you had, we'll say, a couple Jesuits in a house of 7 people and 2 of them are pulling in $300,000 apiece, then that house is pulling in well over $500,000, a house of 7 people, well over $500,000 as income for this community. Now, I don't know what the tax situation is, and I don't know anything about that. Pulling in well into about $700,000, $500,000 more than $500,000. That gets distributed to the whole community in one way or another, either through things that the community can now supply everyone, but no one owns anything. So the car is not owned by anybody, it's owned by the community. If someone wants to buy a music system, the community owns the music system. No one owns it. And that's the way it works. And that's where that vow of poverty comes in, because no one owns anything. But if you have some people paid a decent amount of money, then that community, that particular community, actually will live very well. If you have another community, everyone pulls in 4 figures, then again, all that money is combined, but they're going to live at a much lower standard. It's just the nature of the economy and just nature of the reality. So that's what it is. And that's what they're doing. And they're probably finding that they're experiencing this unique union with Christ and sharing as being something that brings great joy. We'll be back right after this. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Did you know that the Catholic Audio Media Podcast is available on various podcast platforms? You can find us, among others, on Podbean, which is our home platform. You can find it on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeart, among others. Just look for Catholic Audio Media, all one word. On some platforms, such as Spotify, look for Catholic Audio Media, 3 words, and subscribe and listen to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer, previews of upcoming podcasts, previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com, your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com. So I'm sure you've seen in the news the tiff that's been going on between the Pope and the president and vice versa. And it's important to look at this because, of course, the president is upset the Pope is not on board. Now, this has nothing to do with that false story that came out last week that supposedly the papal nuncio was scolded by people in the Pentagon, and that turned out not to be true. So I'm not referring to that at all. I'm talking about something that has been quite documented of the Pope's call for an end to war and other ways to solve difficulties, especially what's going on in the Middle East, and the response from the president of not liking the Pope. These things were actually true, and as far as these things were said. Now, a couple things to look at. The Pope is never going to approve a war. And I'm not saying that I do, by the way. The Pope is never going to do that. And the fact that the Pope is calling out some rhetoric that's being used in this fight is, well, what do you expect? He's the Pope, and he has the right to say that. So we want to look at one of the things that we understand from Catholic teaching. Now, I happen to look up something on magisterium.com. And it makes an interesting point because, in case you don't know, it's a biblical principle. Now, we have to see this within context. It's a biblical principle that war is the consequence of sin. And one of the things that magisterium.com came out with is Catholic teaching can affirm that sin has consequences and that God's providence can permit wars as part of a world in which moral disorder brings suffering. But the Church also warns against a simplistic idea that every war is directly God punishing a particular nation. war remains a morally grave reality that must be judged by the moral law, and even when it follows sin, it is never, therefore, automatically justified. So war is the fruit of sin, as St. James talks about this as well. He says, basically, our passions drive us, and that's where war comes from. But remember, when St. James is writing, war was a whole different type of thing. So we want to look at that, but also when we understand war can be a punishment for sin, not so much God says, well, we will cause war. It's that the conditions from sin that create war happen. But we also need to understand that within the context of humility, because one country saying we in justice will attack another country may not also be looking at the issues in their own country that are sinful and may be open to them falling into a war of some magnitude. So we need to understand that within context, and therefore what we also need to understand is that reality that seeks alternatives to war at all times. Now, we're looking at what's the goal here. The goal of the Pope is to end war totally. The goal of President Trump is to end any kind of nuclear production by Iran. And both of these are extremely legitimate purposes. However, I was listening to the Megyn Kelly show, and I forget the name of her guest today, her guest here on April 13th. One of the things that she said, or that he said, was, and this is something always got to be looked at, in the Middle East world, if the Iranians agree to Trump's conditions in the rest of the Middle East, they will be looked upon as weak, and that's an area of the world where you can't be looked upon as weak. So it was an interesting idea, because that's something that comes out as well. There may be a demand on a country, and they may be all for the demand, but they have to respond to the demand in a way that still allows them to keep their dignity within the other nations. It's very important, because otherwise they can become ripe for the pickings, as the saying goes. And one of the fascinating, if you ever have a chance to see the movie The Emperor, and this was the issue where General MacArthur was basically in charge of taking over Japan after the war. And it turns out the American people and Truman, who was the president at the time, wanted Hirohito, who was the emperor of Japan, to be executed, publicly executed. And this was something that MacArthur was sent to Japan, not only to clean up Japan and try to rebuild Japan, but also to see if this was possible. And he came to realize that no, it wasn't possible, because the Japanese held the emperor to such reverence that it would cause great, great, great damage. So it's a similar principle. And eventually they finally came up to a reality that the emperor had to admit that being an emperor did not make him divine. That was one of the things that they made. But the fascinating thing of the name of the movie is The Emperor. And what you realize about halfway or three-quarters of the way through the movie isn't about the Japanese emperor. It's about MacArthur as emperor. It's very fascinating. It's really, really a great movie. Tommy Lee Jones plays MacArthur, and he does an outstanding job. But you see that. You see all these things will play out in negotiations, and that's always the case. Now, one of the interesting things that's happening here is, as I'm speaking, the United States is closing off the ports for Iran in a form of blockade against Iran, which is an act of war, by the way, but we're already at war. But that is an act of war. And looking at that, so here is this blockade. Well, it was something similar. I don't know the exact context, but it was something about oil that started World War II between the United States and Japan, because it was a fight against the United States. I think it was something like they weren't selling oil to Japan anymore or something like that, that the Japanese decided to invade Pearl Harbor. And fascinating things that come together. So all of these play themselves out in wars, and the question is, how do we find a solution here? And let's face it, if you want me to stand on the side of the Iranian government, you'll be very disappointed, because I never will do that. It doesn't mean I support war. That doesn't mean I support destruction. And don't forget, that doesn't mean I support the words that we will destroy this whole civilization, or however President Trump put it. Doesn't mean any of that at all. But that doesn't mean I'm ever going to say, well, let us look at Japan, Iran as the good people. You will never hear me say that. You may hear me say that about Iranian people, but not about the current Iranian government. But the previous government that was deposed in 1979 was also harsh. And the reason why, as you can see, is there is an intensely harsh element in Iran, and if it is not controlled, you have disaster. So all of this comes together, and the Pope is saying, let's find another solution, and Trump is saying, we already have a solution. We'll work out a negotiation. If the negotiation doesn't happen, we'll wipe them out completely. And the Pope is saying that's not the proper solution. So that is going back and forth, and we want to look at, in prayer, what is our response. We'll be back right after this. Going back to receive your high school diploma can make a huge difference in your life. Not just for you, but for your loved ones and your community as well. Across the country, thousands of free adult education centers are ready to help, with teachers who will guide you every step of the way. Find free and supportive adult education centers near you at finishyourdiploma.org. Brought to you by the Dollar General Literacy Foundation and the Ad Council, and the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer, previews of upcoming podcasts, previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com, your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. Well, tomorrow we have a really interesting story for you. The apostles are thrown in jail, and all of a sudden people discover, hey, I thought you threw those people in jail. What are they doing preaching out on the street? Reminds us always of the story of Padre Pio. Remember, Padre Pio was known to bilocate. He not a lot of times, but he was known to be praying in his cell, and then someone would say, well, I saw him doing X, Y, and Z. There's a famous story of a pilot who was flying in the air. Obviously he's flying a plane, and I think it was a bomber or something. They were going to bomb where Padre Pio was, and he appeared to the pilot in front of the plane and said, go back. A story similar to that. A fascinating little story, Padre Pio. But we're going to look at something a little bit different with the apostles from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 5, that's coming tomorrow on the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. We will see you then.
Yeah. You know the real is back. Father Carr Chaplain from the city of champions, dropping daily reflections coming straight from the field. The raw truth revealed for the strong-willed. It's the Greatest Act of Defiance podcast with your host Father Carr, a message built to last. The Greatest Act of Defiance podcast. That's right, the Greatest Act of Defiance. Word up. Word up. Word up.
The The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.